Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Ridley and I will be supporting Catherine Hamilton today. The session will last for 30 minutes and it is being recorded. However, your video and microphones are all turned off and all you should see is the presentation. All the controls that you need are shown once you hover your cursor at the bottom of the screen. And we will be asking for a bit of participation during the session and ask that you use the Q&A option for this. But should you have any technical issues, please use the chat function to message me privately. The Q&A option is where you can ask Catherine questions at any time. Any questions we do not have time to read out will be answered anonymously and emailed through to you along with a copy of the presentation after the session. So now I'll hand you over to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Kate, and welcome to Why Effective Feedback Conversations Are Essential, and possibly now more than ever in this remote environment that we're all beginning to, hopefully, get used to. But that doesn't mean that we might still be finding having those conversations, making really good communication and dialogue with our colleagues and our team members still can be quite challenging. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover. 5 areas. So why it's important. And we won't spend too long here because hopefully you're on this webinar exactly because you know it's important, but maybe need some reminders and some new tools and techniques about putting it into practice effectively. And even though we know, we sometimes put it off, we avoid it. There are things that get in the way that stops us. So let's just remind ourselves of that. And then the impact when we don't give feedback at all or when we don't give it effectively. So not to the quality that we perhaps would like to receive ourselves. And then we'll have a look at some of the skills required to give effective feedback and explore those, as well as a couple of models and then some tools and techniques about getting it right. So, feedback, some definitions first. Helpful information that we give to someone about improving performance. Sounds good, doesn't it? What are we worried about? And likewise, verbal or non-verbal, it's how we're delivering that feedback. And really important that, isn't it? So even in our remote environment, there's a lot of non-verbal signals that can pass between people that subtly are giving feedback. Now we're going to talk about really being much more purposeful about our feedback, about planning that feedback. And the non-verbal way that we deliver that feedback is equally important to the words that we portray. So what I'd like to know is, first of all, where do you think you are in terms of giving feedback? So let me just ask you a question. So a poll's going to come up. How effective are you right now, perhaps in the last 4 or 5 months, in giving effective and regular feedback? So just pick one of those options. Okay, I can see them all coming in. Obviously used to doing this. And then I'm going to share the results. So we've got everybody voted. Okay, let me end that polling and share those results. So we've got a bit of variety here. Good to see. We've got some good and those that are okay. A poor and then a don't know. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? You know, we don't know what we don't know. So perhaps ask yourself at the end, you know, were you really conscious of all of the different tools and techniques I'm going to give you? And you might think, perhaps I'm not as good as I thought I was. But the person who's put, or the couple of people who put, don't know, let's see what you do know by the end of this. So that's good to see that variety. And I suppose what's really important is that you're here, willing to learn and wanting to know about feedback. So why is it important then? Why do we as managers need to give feedback to our colleagues and our team members? Well, it helps them understand, doesn't it? And it also helps us understand what's going on and how is it being done, the what and the how. And if we talk about feedback as very much a two-way conversation, in the absence of it, we won't have that understanding at all. And surely not understanding, not knowing about performance and behaviour is very, we're leading others, not understanding ourselves. So we need to ensure we're creating and maintaining those highest standards, or at least the expected standards of behaviour for our team members. And it's an opportunity to make sure the proper things, the issues that perhaps aren't being surfaced, are being raised. We can really motivate our individual team members and our teams as a whole if we engage with them, make them feel valued, because we're spending some time and showing that we care really about what they do. And as we've been working in this remote way, we almost have to do that far more purposefully. The spontaneous opportunities don't just occur when we're in the kitchen or the corridor of our buildings. We actually have to make this time more purposeful. But recognizing that you care and that you are valuing what they're doing is really important, and we can help motivate them and build that confidence and create an energy around working towards goals. So we know all this, we know it's important, and yet there's things that get in the way, aren't there? We worry about upsetting people, about saying the wrong thing. One of the biggest fears actually is the consequences. What if I make it worse? What if I open a whole bag of worms and I don't know how to put the lid on it? So these are really, very real reasons why people don't give it. Lack of time. Isn't it strange? At the beginning of lockdown, a lot of people said, it's easier to work. I'm managing my time. I've got a bit more time on my hands. And suddenly everybody seems to have got busier and busier. Well, if we don't make time for these really important conversations, what are we making time for? Try saying to yourself, I don't have time to give feedback, and swap it over and start saying, it's not a priority. And it's incredible what that reframing does. And do you really believe it's not a priority? Well, hopefully not, because you're on this webinar. So shouldn't be a reason, should it, not having enough time? We need to make the time. It might be, how do we do it? Not quite sure. Maybe you don't receive much feedback yourself. You haven't got much of a benchmark. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to share some of those skills to do that. It might even be, what if the repercussions lead to tribunal action? And you might think that, well, if I don't say anything, I'm sure it will sort itself out all on its own without me intervening. Now, these are genuine reasons, and in a virtual world, maybe there's even more. We're worrying about the misinterpretation. I'm not in the same room as them, so it just makes it a bit harder to have real conversations. It's not personal enough. But it's so important. We can't allow us working in this remote environment to be another reason for not giving feedback. Because if we don't, these are some of the consequences. The situation may not actually get worse, but it definitely won't get better. If anything, it might just stay as it is. And of course, we know that staying as it is isn't where we want it to be. It's not meeting the standard. We might have noticed that performance has dropped, or there's something around the behaviour that's causing ripples across the team. So we need to step in. The behaviours that we're not giving feedback on become more ingrained and accepted by that person. That sort of living in blissful ignorance may be a blind spot for somebody. Of course, we're assuming that they might be doing it on purpose, and they must know, so they'll put it right themselves. Well, what if? What if it's a blind spot? They have no idea. They need some feedback. Otherwise, that behaviour becomes more and more normalised. And then performance lowers because you haven't stepped in to say something early on. And because the behaviour becomes normalised and performance lowers, the motivation of those around is also affected and also the performance. So it just has a knock-on effect and gets worse and worse. And of course, there's you thinking, well, I don't want to step in, I don't want to rock the boat and I like to be liked. Well, actually, it has the reverse effect, that you as a manager then lose respect because of all of this that's happening. So let me ask you this question. If somebody knew something about you that would help you do something better, grow, develop, reach your potential, wouldn't you want to know? And because I'm really interested in that answer, I'd like you to pick a yes or no. If someone knew something about you that would help you be better, grow, develop, wouldn't you want to know? I'm just waiting for you all to vote. A couple more seconds on that. I don't think this will be a surprise to any of you when you see the results. Okay, so I'm going to share the results 100% and absolutely as we would expect. Of course, you would want to know. So think about that when you're holding back from giving feedback to somebody else. You wouldn't want somebody to have all those reasons to not give you some feedback. And there's this wonderful quote from Peter Honey. Most people, for most of the time, are starved of feedback and are left to operate on the basis of no news is good news. And of course, we do think that, don't we, sometimes? Well, if nobody's saying anything, we must assume I'm doing it okay. Well, actually, people do crave, they want feedback. So rather than just only telling people that they're doing well, research and studies have actually said that people want feedback. And that feedback means giving them some details of how they can improve. So let me share some of that with you. So Thomas International showed that 4 in 10 workers feel disengaged when they receive little or no feedback. And 43% of highly engaged employees receive feedback once a week. So you can see there's a real correlation between the highly engaged, and we know if people are highly engaged, they're also more motivated, they're more likely to be a high performer and productive. Now, the Harvard Business Review had some other statistics. So 72%, almost 3/4, said that constructive feedback was the key to improving performance. I think all this data just supports us giving more rather than less developmental and constructive feedback. And look at that, more than half preferred corrective feedback to praise. So that might go against everything you've ever thought about feedback. It's really useful, not only for you to give it, so you raise your understanding, but look, your team members are wanting it. And interestingly, research from the London Business School shows that high-performing team members need more positive affirmation after setbacks, which is a really good argument for not leaving our competent employees, or anyone else for that matter, to simply get on with it. We mustn't take anything for granted. So to keep that high motivation and engagement, constructive feedback really is a necessity. So hopefully you're absolutely on that mindset. We need to do this. We know we want to do it. So how? So let me ask you a question. I'm going to show you a picture now. And I would like you to, in the question and answer session, jot down, what do you see? So what springs to mind to describe what you see when I show you this picture? So jot it down in the Q&A. Okay, thank you. A few of them coming through. So we've got shame, telling off, mother telling off daughter, protection and concern, not for me to judge, someone being told off, admonishment, it's a mouthful. The little girl is not responding to the feedback. I like that. It's a good connection there. Judgmental mother. Okay. So I think we've got enough there. Worry, mixed, not sure, they're still holding hands, judgmental, okay. So come back, look at that picture. In those seconds when I asked you to jot down what you see, what sort of assumptions have you made? What sort of interpretations? Now I can see from that already there's a relationship that has been assumed, a mother-daughter. We've assumed that it's a telling off, that it's shame, that it's a judgment going on. All of that happens in seconds. We interpret what we see and what we hear in a moment, and we may get that wrong. So in fact, if we were going to pull this back and pause slightly and think, actually, what can I see? Well, we can see there's a lady wearing a yellow dress. They've both got open-toe sandals. The little girl has got her chin on her chest. She's looking down. The lady has got her left arm raised and one finger extended. Can you see how different that is from she looks angry, she's telling off, she's shouting? We really don't know. And when we give feedback, I like you to remember this. So remember, this is a lady in a yellow dress, not a mother shouting at her daughter. I'm sure if I asked you, where are they? Immediately you thought park. We have put benches, grass, pavements, trees all together and thought park, but we don't know. It's an interpretation of what we've seen. So my encouragement to you is really take care and be aware of making generalizations and assumptions when you're giving feedback. Rather than saying you're very aggressive, we might say you've leant forward over my desk and you're raising your voice. Very, very different. So let's have a look at some effective feedback skills. And they're good people communication skills, but they absolutely are core to giving feedback. So listening. It's so easy to make assumptions, isn't it, about somebody else based on just a few pieces of information. Real listening is about holding back from jumping to conclusions and genuinely working to understand the other person's perspective. So we really need to seek to understand. Being attentive means really paying close attention to the detail, showing care and being courteous, but also consider your own distractions. Think about when you're in your remote, maybe in a room in your home, all those distractions that might be getting in the way when you're giving feedback. Think about your own emotional state. If you've already built up some frustration around this situation, it may distract you with the impact of your listening, the level of your listening and attentiveness. Encouraging the other person to talk, and that can be through your non-verbals or through just encouraging, saying, tell me a bit more about that. I'm really interested to hear. So remember, effective feedback is as much about the ask as it is about the give information. Pausing, another great skill in listening, and it really is a skill in itself. Having the confidence to pause and hold the silence where it's needed. It allows space for the others to think and talk rather than us butting in and speaking on their behalf. And then open questions, asking open, non-judgmental questions, using that clean language where we're aware of our tone and the language that we use. So we need to make sure that our probing and our inquiry questions are designed to understand more rather than be confrontational. So using tell me more about that is far more effective than why do you do that? And interestingly, and I'm sure you've come across this before, that when we use the why question, it's generally received in a way that causes people to get defensive. They feel like you're attacking them, maybe questioning their beliefs and values, and it's not a good place to start or have a feedback conversation around. And then finally, the skill of building empathy. Really important that we listen empathetically. Many of us only ever achieve that surface listening, hearing the words or maybe a selection of those words someone says. But real empathetic listening is listening between the lines and being alert to all that tone and non-verbal signals, and sometimes what is not being said as much as what is being said. So let me give you an example. Someone who in your team is very quiet and rarely contributes in meetings. We might find this frustrating, and we might see it as an indication they're not making much effort. Or we could tell ourselves a very different story about them, that they might find big groups of talkative people quite daunting, for example. And that creates more of an empathy in you when you're having that feedback conversation rather than frustration. So we need to build empathy to be able to be much more open-minded. So let me build on those skills and share some feedback techniques. So the BOOST model is a way of sharing some of the principles around feedback. So we need to make sure we keep our feedback in perspective, balance. What's the real key message that you need to get across? And don't dilute it with all those other pleasantries. I've often heard people saying, oh, that was a great presentation. You didn't speak loudly enough, but don't worry about it. It was all good. And I often wonder, what do they go away with remembering? If your message was they didn't speak loudly enough, then make sure that's the message that they hear. And the other thing about balance, don't be known for only giving praise. Remember, people want constructive feedback. But also don't only give feedback when it's the constructive sort. We need to be balanced in what we give. Make sure it's observed and factual. It's real. It's based on what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've actually got, that data. It's really important so we don't make those generalizations. And likewise, make sure it's objective. This isn't a personal attack on the other person. We need to concentrate on the behavior or the task and not the person. And that helps us avoid those sort of assumed interpretations. And it's really important here to own your feedback. Say, I saw, I heard, I noticed. Okay? And then S, the specific. And this links to the lady in the yellow dress. Avoid those general comments, particularly things like, oh, you always do, or I've never heard you. It's really not useful. We need to find the feedback that is specific enough, objective and observed, that the receiver can do something with. So make sure it's relevant to them. And then finally, timely. Let's make sure we do it sooner rather than later. Yes, find an appropriate time, but being prompt is the key, as feedback loses all its impact if it's left. And actually, it's sometimes, more frustrating and disappointing for the receiver when they realize they've almost missed the opportunity to put something right because you've waited. Alongside these principles, there's a model that we use very regularly, which is the SAID model. And just want to share what these each stand for. So S is sort of naming that situation, when it happened, or the standard. It might be reference to your dress code policy or your customer standards. The A is actually what you've observed or what's actually happened, what's the action. Impact is the most powerful thing that often gets missed. So what was the impact on them carrying out this action? And then D can be really about what are we going to do? What can you do to develop that? What is the desired outcome? What are we looking to achieve? Let me give you a couple of examples just to take you through that. And it might be simple as yesterday morning. So here we have the situation. You scheduled in a meeting with myself for 2 p.m. and then you didn't show. Okay, didn't show up. I rescheduled a customer so we could meet, and then I waited for 15 minutes while still trying to contact you by email and on the phone. So the impact. So there's no generalization so far. It's all specific. It's all exactly what happened. What are you going to do about this? Okay, asking the question. Let me give you another example, slightly different. At our last session, we agreed that you would send me the draft report in advance by email so that I could read through. That hasn't happened. So I've been unable to prepare anything. What can we do to prevent that happening again? Now, if you notice, I've asked it as a question at the end, and I've included we. It's quite supportive. But sometimes, if this is the third time you've had this conversation, or if this is really quite serious, then you might want to say, what I want you to do is, and you actually outline the desired outcome. So there's a balance between using the specific feedback with the asking questions. One of the biggest things that happens with feedback is we don't know about the other person and what they already know themselves. You know, what is their intention? So it's always better to ask them. So how did you feel that went with the client? What were you pleased with? What do you think you could have done differently? And then you have some time to think about how much of your specific feedback do you need to share. Because you might find they know exactly what has happened and what needs to be done, or you might find they actually are living in blissful ignorance and they have no idea about their actions or the impact. And therefore we need to be much firmer, much more specific, and much more in that tell feedback mode. So finally, let me share some of the top tips about setting this up for success. So don't wait, nip it in the bud. Timing is so, so important. Think about your intention. What would you like to gain from this conversation, and what would be beneficial for them? Make sure your mind is on that and not about some of the assumptions that you might have been making. If you have an assumption in your head that they're very disorganized, or you're getting very frustrated about something, it will limit the way that you can receive the information that you hear from them. Make sure you prepare yourself and them. If you've been thinking about this and gathering your data, then make sure they have that same opportunity and name it. Say, you know, can we talk about the last client meeting that we had and book some time in our diaries? Give them the opportunity to prepare. And then make sure when you're starting the feedback that you outline what's going to happen. And it might be that you say, I'm really interested to hear from you, and then I'll add on how I've seen the situation, and then we'll talk about how we go from here. And then keep bringing back. You might find that if it's uncomfortable, you go off agenda. You start talking about the task or something quite different because it's easier. So keep coming back to what you're supposed to be talking about. Encourage note-taking so that you absolutely know that both of you have kept a record of what you've talked about, particularly the actions that they're taking away to do. And then finally, make sure you have a clear ending. Ask them. So what is it you're taking from this conversation? What is it you're going to do differently? What might you need from me to make sure that happens? Make sure you schedule in a follow-up. You know, feedback is not a one-way hit. It's a continuous process. So make sure you offer the opportunity to follow up. And then thank them. Thank them for their time and for having the conversation with you. Okay, so we've now got time for some questions. That was sort of a whistle-stop tour of some ideas and tips and a couple of models, the BOOST and the SED model. So really interested, if you've got some questions, to please put them on the question and answer. We did have a couple of questions in advance, so I will just have a look at some of those while we're waiting for any others to come on live. So one of the questions that we had was, I don't receive any feedback, so I have nothing to compare it to. Really interesting. So first of all, I would say, well, go and ask for some feedback. Make sure you're not living in blissful ignorance and ask for some feedback. But the other side of that is ask yourself, how would you like to be approached? How would you like someone to give feedback to you? And use that as the start point. I was with somebody just the other day and asked them, how would you like to give feedback? And they said, oh, really direct, to the point, come and just tell me, don't beat around the bush. And yet they were doing exactly that themselves with a team. So be really aware of how you would like to be approached and use that. Okay, I've got one here. I want to give a team member some feedback, but they have reacted badly in the past. What can I do? Really good question, because that has already got our mindset thinking about, oh dear, this is going to be difficult. So first of all, I would encourage you to think this is another opportunity for another conversation. Try and be open-minded about it. Be really intentional. What's the purpose of this question, of this feedback? We often blame the other person for their reaction. We can do a lot to prevent that reaction by preparing ourselves and preparing them. And if we could ask more about how do you think this is going? What have you found difficult? What have you enjoyed? What do you think you've done well? All of those really open questions. Have more of a conversation with them. If it becomes appropriate, relevant, that actually right then they are not hearing the conversation or they're reacting, ask yourself again, what might I have done that has triggered this defensiveness, this difficult reaction in the other person? And what more could I do to help them hear what we're saying? And then it's also appropriate to actually talk about what's actually happening there and then. Name it. We're having a conversation. There's some feedback I really would like to give to you because I think we can work differently on this. And what I'm noticing is that you're not wanting to engage in this feedback conversation. Can I ask you what's going on for you right now? So there's a number of things that we can own and take control of ourselves. So try and use that. Okay, we've got, so what should I do if the person deflects the feedback? Really good question. I mean, almost similar. It's really hard if you've not received feedback very often. If you're not used to receiving feedback, it can be quite scary. So again, really prepare them for that this is a conversation about how, specifically about how we can work differently with that client. You might need to be really keep repeating. So this is the feedback, this has been the impact. What can we do about that? I'm really interested to hear your views. Use that listening, that empathy to engage them as much as possible. A lot of people don't want to hear feedback, maybe because they've had a poor experience in the past of feedback that hasn't been about things that they could change, but have been a personal attack, and that is not useful for anybody. So some great questions. I'm very aware that we have run out of time, but if you're interested in finding out more, please go on our website. We will follow up with the questions and we will put the webinar on the website. And we've got 2 more coming up over the next 2 Thursdays that also link to our remote leading series. Feedback can be tough. It's a challenging time out there. So we really encourage you to work with what we've talked about today and join these other sessions to think about yourself as a leader and being the best version of yourself that you can be. So thank you very much for joining us today. Stay in touch, go onto the website and see our previous webinars and the training that we can offer. And any questions, pass them through to Kate Ridley at Focal Point Training. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us. Thank you.